Hello and welcome to my vlog. This will be talking about the Vietnam War today. And when you talk about wars and anything in history, there's always a question of periodization. Where do we start? Where do we end? Now, with a traditional war, there's usually a declaration of war, but usually there's also events leading up to that declaration, so there's still a question of where do you start, really, and then a treaty at the end. But the U.S. hasn't declared war since World War II. So on the Vietnam War, there's not a declaration of war we can start off of. So I've chosen to start at the Declaration of Independence by the Vietnamese people. So just a little background to the declaration. I guess technically that's not the start. The Vietnam was part of French Indochina. So it was controlled by the French until during World War II, Japan took it from the French. And then America defeated Japan, well, the Allies defeated Japan, and so it left this big void. And so according to the book Vietnam War, A Topical Exploration and Primary Source Collection, it says Viet Minh leader Ho Chi Minh now filled the void. On August 16, 1945, in Hanoi, Ho declared himself president of the Provisional Government of a Free Vietnam. 3 days later, on August 19th, the Viet Minh seized power in Hanoi in what was known at the time as the August General Uprising and was soon renamed the August Revolution. It was followed by uprising against the French in other towns and cities across Vietnam. So, the French had never actually left Vietnam completely. They had been imprisoned by the Japanese during the Japanese occupation. But they began trying to take it back, basically immediately. Now, George Washington, in his farewell address, said, and this is quoted in a Foreign Affairs article that I will link down below. He said, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world." And Thomas Jefferson clarified in his inaugural address, "Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." America in Indochina could have learned from this. We had an alliance with France, of course, but we had also created an alliance with Ho Chi Minh and assisted him against the Japanese when it was to our benefit. After the fall of Japan, the peace treaty with Japan, when now Ho Chi Minh's enemy was France. Well, France is our oldest ally. France helped us win our revolution, so of course we're going to help them. And so that was a difficult situation. Ho Chi Minh obviously appreciated the U.S.'s help in defeating Japan and wanted us to continue that relation. As quoted in this book, Major Problems in American History Since 1945, which I will hereafter refer to as Major Problems, on page 291, Ho Chi Minh actually quoted from the U.S. Declaration of Independence at the beginning of his declaration. An alliance between America and Vietnam was not meant to be. Ellen Schrecker wrote an article called Anti-Communism at Home that kind of lays out the feelings at home. It says, over the next few years, the Cold War escalated as both the United States and the Soviet Union took ostensibly defensive actions that looked ever more threatening to the other side. The USSR solidified its hold over Eastern Europe, imposing communist governments throughout the region, largely in order to ensure its own security. Truman and his advisors, however, assumed that the Kremlin's desire for expansion had no limits, and they came to view all American foreign policy within the context of a worldwide struggle against communism. Containment shaped every program, whether it was economic aid to Western Europe, and here's the part that applies to us, or for military assistance to the French in Southeast Asia. So that's what our involvement in Vietnam started out as, just military assistance to the French to try to contain communism. And by the mid-1950s, President Eisenhower explained the domino theory. Finally, you have the broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of disintegration that would have the most profound influences. And just so you know, this paper I'm working off of is a paper that I wrote for my history class, and I'm expanding upon for this video. So this quote shows that President Eisenhower saw the threat of communism in Vietnam on a global scale. If Vietnam was allowed to fall, it wouldn't be long before the entire world was under communist rule. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see that this just wasn't the case. However, looking at the situation from their perspective, with the communist China and the USSR, Americans will be far outnumbered if those two allied against us, not to mention the threat of nuclear Russia. So you can see how Vietnam looked crucial in the larger scheme of things. And on page 309 in the Major Problems book, there is an essay that deals with this. It is called A Necessary War by Michael Lind. It says, at different times, the domino effect was used to mean a regional domino effect, a global revolutionary wave effect, or a global bandwagon effect. It was feared that the loss of South Vietnam to Hanoi-sponsored communist insurgents would lead to communist takeovers in neighboring countries in Indochina or Southeast Asia, or to copycat communist or anti-Western revolutions in other areas of the developing world, or to bandwagoning with or appeasement of the Soviet Union or Communist China by U.S. allies, and neutrals, unsure of the reliability of U.S. security guarantees. In the worst case, all three of these dominoes effects might occur. So you can see that the fear went far beyond just Vietnam, and so that's one major reason why we committed ourselves so fully in Vietnam. And within Vietnam, the Viet Cong also had a recruiting field that was ripe for the picking. The farmers had been mistreated for years under French rule, and then again under Japanese occupation. And the Viet Cong came in and told them, as quoted on page 297 of Major Problems, if the poor people don't stand up to the rich people, we would be dominated by them forever. So you can see how the Viet Cong was able to recruit. And also you can see how if this message got out, the mistreatment of the people, that Americans would start to empathize with them. That's exactly what Carl Oglesby was trying to capitalize on in 1965 in a speech that's quoted on page 301 of Major Problems. It says, or what Carl Oglesby talked about, discussed how he believed the founders would be on the other side of the war from America. This, he posits, because the war in Vietnam, in which we were interfering, was essentially a revolution, and we were backing the old government. Oglesby compares the Vietnam War and the American Revolution point by point. Things such as troops coming in from outside the country, rebels being armed by foreign countries, the rebels being in the minority, and acts of terror, he says, are all points that the American Revolution has in common with the Vietnam War. Now, so side by side with this, you did have a growing movement in America of people who just weren't happy with the situation in Vietnam. And this all came to a head in the 1968 presidential convention, the Democratic Presidential Convention 1968. There was a planned protest of 100,000 protesters. Now, as it turned out, only about 25,000 showed up. No, only about 5,000 showed up. But the mayor had prepared for 100,000, and so he prepared 25,000 troops from the National Guard and the police force to protect his convention and the convention goers. Well, things quickly got out of hand, and so you had broadcast over to the nation, police and National Guardsmen 5-1 ganging up on these protesters. It was not a pretty picture. At the same time this was going on, there was the presidential election, and Richard Nixon was running against the sitting vice president. Now, Richard Nixon's top fundraiser was this woman named... oh gosh, did I lose it? Wait, no, there it is. Anne Chanoff. And so this situation was called the Chanoff Affair, in which Richard Nixon, through Chanoff, fed information to Ho Chi Minh and basically convinced him to boycott the peace agreement, or peace accords, that the president was trying to set up. This was for purely political reasons, so that the vice president couldn't have on his resume that he achieved peace in Vietnam. Now, by 1969, just after Nixon won by the narrowest of margins, Henry Kissinger wrote him a letter, as quoted in Major Problems on page 303 to 306. And in it, he talked about his concerns. There were already student demonstrations planned for October, and these types of events could be expected to increase. Second was the question of turning the war effort over to the South Vietnamese in what was known as Vietnamization. Henry Kissinger was in favor of this, but he laid out a list of how challenging it would be. Third, he spoke of weaknesses within the South Vietnamese government. The leader of the South Vietnamese was Catholic, and he hadn't really done a lot to try to build coalitions with the majority Buddhists in Vietnam. And on the diplomatic front, Kissinger assessed there wasn't enough threat of progress against North Vietnam to force them into concessions when they're negotiating a settlement. In addition to this, the North Vietnamese strategy was more sustainable, and therefore it was much more likely that they would continue making gains in the war effort. And so, what did Nixon do with this information? He did what you can expect from Nixon. He did the politically expedient thing instead of the morally right thing. According to the video by the Miller Center, it's the first in their 4 videos on Watergate. Late in the video, about the 15-minute mark, I believe, they're discussing the Chanoff Affair and ultimately how Nixon treated the Vietnam situation. And he says that at that time everyone knew that when the U.S. troops withdrew, within 2 years Vietnam would fall, and people would say, what was the point of our boys fighting there? Just to lose the war. So what Nixon did is he prolonged the war until election time, and then he withdrew our troops, pulled us out, brought the boys home, and set himself up for a major win. Obviously, at the same time, in that same campaign, he was, while not orchestrating, he was setting up the climate that allowed the Watergate break-in, and then, of course, covering it up once he found out about it. Because all that information would lead back, the Chanoff Affair and everything else, and he knew it would be his downfall if it got out. So, all this really damaged America. Eventually we were able to get out of Vietnam, but the damage to the American public was already done. Never again would Americans as a whole blindly trust their government to do what is best for them. The confidence gap had been created, and it would be impossible to fill, although it has been bridged from time to time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my analysis on the Vietnam War. If you liked what you see, give this video a like. If you really liked it, subscribe and drop me a comment with what I should talk about in my next video. Thanks, and have a great day.